Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On Writing. I'm Jim Groom, coming to you from Reclaim Hosting. And as you can see right now, it's just me. I think I might have gotten my wires crossed with Adam, meaning I sent him the link a little too close for comfort. So he may jump in at any point. But I figured, hey, I have the time. I put it aside. There may be one or two people out there checking out the stream. So, um, hey, why not go ahead? And if anyone out there, if Adam doesn't show up, uh, that's kind of on me. I'll be clear there. Anyway, so this series, if I could do a little bit of a reflection just on the series so far, it started with Audrey Waters. Then we moved to Kin Lane. And then we talked with Mike Caulfield, then Tom Woodward and Amy Collier. Last week, we had a great discussion with Kathleen Fitzpatrick. And this week, we're going to talk with Adam Croom from the University of Oklahoma, who has had an interesting career doing kind of various things and always moving around doing new and kind of creative things. He was one of the first folks who kind of adopted and brought Domain of One's Own out into the open and almost made Reclaim possible. So a little bit of love there. But the idea of the whole kind of show or the series is to think about writing and think about like what it is we do when we write, what our history is as a writer, and ideally, how does kind of the writing on the web in all its different kind of fashions weave into that? And there is an ulterior motive here, right? The ulterior motive is probably very much in line with Reclaim Hosting's vision, which is, writing in your own space and managing your own space in some ways is kind of good for the ecosystem of the web, right? Kind of, sure, we could all be on platforms, but we kind of see what goes on there. And there are limits there, although that's where people are. But what does it mean to reflect and have a space of your own? And that has been kind of interesting for me, obviously, because I came to a job at the University of Mary Washington where I had just before I got there started my blog as a kind of blog father, right? I had a blog for my newborn son, and I was blogging pictures, and I was playing with this newfangled tool called WordPress, and this is 2004. And then I got a job, and this is 2005 now, where the job required for me to not only get a cPanel account and set up my own blog and get my own domain, but then to use that blog as a way to document my work as a instructional technologist, right? And that's kind of a unique situation looking back 20 odd years later. So I really like that. And Tom, Alan, I don't know if either of you want to jump in here with me, but I think I've had quite a day, but my wires with the great Adam Croom must have gotten confused. So anyway, I can salvage this though, because I'm a professional. And one way to do that is just put the link in the chat. But anyway, I'm thinking about my own kind of reflections as a blogger and a writer. And it really started at Mary Washington, where I started the blog Bava Tuesdays, which has since gone on to be a space where I kind of write and reflect and have fun. And so many connections and so many possibilities have kind of emerged out of that. And I kind of think like trying not much to look back simply in nostalgia or simply to say, hey, the good old days. But the idea, if we're watching all of these other alternatives go as badly as they have been and continue to, and that goes for Facebook, that goes for, that's awesome. Tom is the best. That goes for Facebook, Twitter, all that. But maybe a return to the blog isn't all that bad, Tom, right?
I mean, it's done you well so far. Jim, how much would you attribute the blogging to your success as, I don't know, human?
Oh, as a human? I think a
Yeah.
lot. I mean, because I'm never more human than when I'm blogging. And warts and all. I think everybody knows when I've written a post that I didn't even spell check it, no less run it through AI.
That's boring.
It is boring.
And nothing like classic on the spot going live. And man, there's nothing like what DS-106 taught us when we went on the radio and did this stuff, Jim.
Right? Why not? And I'll tell you, I actually thank you both for jumping in here and saving me, because you saw how bad it was going. But the other piece, the other piece there, right? Like, I mean, I really enjoy having these spaces that you carve out. And, you know, whether it's a blog or even whether it's just a series on writing, right? Like, it started off as, you know, maybe Bloggers Anonymous and trying to get, you know, Marin had this great idea and trying to get, but then the more we're going into it, now as we're starting to think about Reclaim Open and starting to think about this, the more I'm thinking like, Twitter's a shitstorm. Facebook, you know, brought us, you know, the election of 2016. And we talk about all the different things these different kind of platforms per se have resulted in. And I'm thinking like, you know, the blog's not perfect, but a space like that in context with people like, for example, you two, who I've connected with and have relations with in relation, I have relations with in a relation of like kind of playfully living in this space online. It has served me well, kind of, in if I'm thinking through that. And I don't want to return to it in a nostalgic way, even though I'm given to that. I want to return to it in almost a practical way. Like, practically, it might be a good alternative to a lot of the junk that's out there right now. Respond.
We're waiting. This is the dramatic pause where we make sure Jim has like time to breathe. And, you know,
I'm just winging it here.
You know, I mean, nostalgia is not bad, but it's not like, I mean, you phrased it perfectly. It's not a desire to dial back. And I've been in several of these conversations where, you know, people are like, oh, the state of things, like, and it's heavy. And I keep coming back to this, like, if I never experienced 2014, 2009, like, you know, that would be so empty to not have lived that. And so we had that grand opportunity. And now we do it differently, but, you know, I don't know if I can make the case, you know, I don't know if I ever could make the case for people to take this on. You just have to do it, or not, you know, and you know, I, you know, people do what they do. And anyhow, like, you know, I miss the heyday at the same time. Like you, I don't want to go back to that.
No.
And I don't think I have a sentence.
You're not selling blogging. I brought you on here, Alan, to sell blogs.
If you blog today, you will get
this knife. Blog with this knife.
Well, it's always funny to me because people want it to be like a thing with a right or wrong, and it could be whatever you want. And there's Adam Croom. So we
Adam.
Sorry.
Take us off now.
It is Jim's fault. I'm 100% sure.
I got the time zone wrong. I'm like, I'm in CT time, so my apologies. And then I figured it out
early.
I'm early. So now I'm early.
An hour early now. No, that's my fault, Adam. I didn't get you the link until literally a half an hour before the event. So I take full responsibility. But in fact, one of the things that we were talking about is, you know, and it's an interesting segue into what we're going to discuss. Like, you know, our blog stories, like if you have a blog origin story, as you kind of start thinking about, you know, you as a writer. And I was reading your blog, Adam, leading up to this, and kind of one of the early posts you write from 2013 is you're writing about writing to become elected as a fifth grader to, you know, a class representation. I thought that's a very interesting kind of story that you're blogging and relating openly. And I wonder, like, your story as a writer leading up to kind of like where you are now as a professional, and what has that road been like? And, how has the blog played into that?
Yes.
I still
First,
got it.
I'm so excited to see Alan and Tom. Let me just say that real quick. This is such a great party. Yeah. So I'll say, as a kid, I felt like I was like maybe other folks too, awkward in like the way in which I felt like I could best communicate my own thoughts was to do so through writing. And I remember very vividly, even before fifth grade, I think it was in second grade. So it's like you just learn to write like stories, like you're no longer writing words, and you're putting full sentences together. And I wrote a story about a t-ball home run and like the emotions of running around the bases. And I remember my second grade teacher getting to the front of the class, but she didn't do this a lot, but being like, I want to read you the story that someone turned in. And she started reading my story, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's like, I've never thought that you could like write for an audience, like my teacher's kind of telling me something, and that was kind of like a light bulb moment. And then I do remember in fifth grade, my English teacher, we would read our stories that we wrote in the front of the class a lot. And I remember her telling me after reading one, like, I could really see you majoring in creative writing. And that was like the first time that I thought about writing as a profession. I was like, that's really interesting. And so like through like my thread through school was there was always a component of media. Like it was like a newspaper, in school, or journalism class or yearbook, and then getting into like web design classes, like early web design classes and graphic design, and kind of like being like an editor of like the channel that our high school ran. Like that kind of stuff was always sort of like the thread. But to the story of being in fifth grade, I was running for student council, and I was really nervous about writing the speech. And at the time, after school, I was being dropped off by the bus at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather handed me a very popular book at the time, which was the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is like not a fifth grade book, just to be clear. Stephen Covey was not. We were reading Hatchet or something like that. I still remember like concepts that were in the book about like creating like win-win strategies and that kind of stuff. And so I was weaving this into my speech, and I did not win, but my teacher was very impressed by the speech, and so I think she put me on like safety committee and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I really do attribute like the nurturing of teachers, right? To like being able to see a talent there and nurture that, and then school having just like the space, right, and places to kind of test it out and kind of tinker with different mediums, whether it's video or web or graphics or just English classes and literature.
It's interesting too, because one of the things I really liked about that post, and I wonder, like, when you were writing it, is this the intent? Like, you're like, and I didn't win in sixth grade, and I didn't win in seventh grade, and then I think my political career, is going to move me over to the AV club because this was not it. But like, also, like, it's funny, like you're being funny, and I like that you're setting up a very serious story, and then you're not giving us the kind of, oh, and then everything worked out, and I got elected, and all the kids loved me. In fact, no, I was still the odd kid out. But like, how much of your writing also is to kind of think through and openly share a part of who you are, right? Like, because as you're kind of writing online, and we were just talking about this as you jumped on, is like, as a result of my writing online, and unlike you, no teacher ever said I should write. They're like, actually, you're a really bad writer, and you should probably do something like, whatever, but stay away from writing because you don't know how to use grammar. You're not very eloquent, and all of these things. And the thing that's interesting is, like, even that, because it was so hard, I continued to do it. But it's also through those anecdotes and through that kind of finding a sense of like humor, or whether it's just connection, that writing online, as we have, just seemed like a different thing, right? It seemed different than that essay or that speech, right? It seemed like actually I'd escaped some of the logic of the institution that I was kind of playing to, but wasn't very good at.
Yeah, I think so. I think my like the burning piece inside of me that has to like put something out, right, is like part of, I think, part of my identity that's always been there, like, is like being an artist or a creative, right? And I think the thing that kind of caught my eye when I would do this in school was just like, I was not trying to impress the teacher, right? Like, I'm trying to, kind of get the attention, of the people in the room. And so like, like there is whether it was like writing music, like it's never been for me to just keep it for myself, right? I've got to put it out there. And so a lot of times, there is I'm that feeling when you hit the publish button, right, of like, it's out there now, like there's no going back. That's a really, really interesting, almost intoxicating feeling. And so that's always been it. I think sometimes people think that it's like, well, you must be doing it because it's like it's branding, or like you're trying to get your own personal name out there. And it's never been that at all. Like, it's just like, this is how I kind of let things go, or like move on from there, or close the chapter. I worked for our newspaper when I was in college, and I wasn't a writer. I did like production stuff, but which meant I was the last person to touch the paper before it went to the printer. And there was like just some interesting feeling about like, to like sort of take a business term, like I had to ship something every night. Like, it was a daily paper Monday through Friday, and around 10 or 11 o'clock PM, like whenever we finished it, like it just had to go out, and it wasn't going to get changed. It was going to be printed in paper, in ink, right? And it was going to exist in university archives, right? Forever. How, just whatever we put out that day. And so I just like, that was like a really good feeling of just knowing like I'm putting something out in the world every time that I click the button, or I pushed something to FTP or something, whatever the method was, right? Has always just been something that I feel like I must do. And that's what's kind of kept me continuing to write and publish, although it kind of varying volumes over the years.
Now, when did you start getting into blogging?
Well, that's so, yeah. So one of my early posts as well. So I was like like an early child of the web, right? And I remember one of the very first account that I ever created for myself was on geocities.com. And I remember, like, I don't know how I found out about it, but I remember signing up for it. And I remember reading the terms of service, because it said something like, you should read all this, and you should probably print it out to have a copy of your own. And so I literally was like printing the entire like terms and conditions. My parents were incredibly frustrated, like the amount of like ink and paper I was using to do this. But I never signed up for an account. But I was like really, really intoxicated with this idea of like having this own website, And so so my early web presence was building like fan sites for things that I liked. I think my first site was like for like WWF, and then I had a site for like Harry Potter, and then it became like bands that I was interested in, And so that was the kind of stuff that I was doing on early web stuff. Was like, it was a way to express myself through like the interests that I had as a kid. And the way that I learned how to build the websites was, there was this website called lisaexplains.com. I think it's actually still up. It's LISSA explains.com. And it was basically this HTML for kids. And I would kind of like read, she had basically kind of craft all this. If you want to build a table, if you want to change the background color, if you want to have a thing that follows the cursor, like all that kind of like, late 90s, early web stuff. And so I really like Lisa was like my asynchronous teacher, I guess, in some ways. And I remember I had formed like an image in my head of who Lisa was. And the image of who Lisa was in my head was like, she looked like a teacher of mine at school. Like I just imagined this lady who was passionate about sharing this. And years later, what I found out was Lisa was actually my exact same age. And what was cool about it is like I was learning from another kid who was also trying to learn. And basically, as she would figure things out, she'd just kind of put it on a web page, and it would kind of be. It started as her reference space, but then became like kind of this like viral phenomenon. And she was like being written about by like MSN and the USA Today and stuff like that. And so, anyways, like I really come to appreciate this idea of like kids teaching kids, and I've always sort of imagined like if we were to throw a party of like all the people that learned from Lisa, and that are all around the same age and like just chatted about like what our careers were, I assume that it would be like we all probably landed in a lot of similar spaces. Like we were interested in initially just kind of expressing ourselves through like our fan stuff, And so that led to early like blogging, whether it was on LiveJournal, or I know I had like a Zynga at one point, a blog spot. Like I've used every platform, Tumblr, like at some point, in like high school, college time, like that early blogging stuff was when I was in college. That's what I was always using.
What was the other one around then? There was LiveJournal, but there was one, and they would have those crazy backgrounds, and it was like the one social media where the guy got out early, and people like he's the only respectable one of those. It wasn't Friendster.
Was it MySpace?
MySpace. That's it. Absolutely.
I huge MySpace. Yeah. Yeah. I owe a lot. I mean, I think that was where for a lot of time, like I built like my first audience, and so here's a fun story. Like once, I don't know if you went through this, but when we had it, when Katie, my wife,
puberty,
and
I've been there.
Yeah. When we were pregnant, or when she was pregnant with our first daughter, and like people go through nesting, and my nesting thing was literally cleaning up all these blogs that still existed, and I archived all of them, and so like I have all of the blog stuff that I was writing from like 2000 to whenever 2007 or something like that, and across all these different sites. And it's interesting to read what you were writing then in the voice, because like I can read it and I'm like, oh yeah, I was reading like a lot of like Chuck Palahniuk books at that point. Like I can see it in my writing, or I was reading like a lot of like Chuck Klosterman, and I'm watching my voice evolve over time, right? Which starts with like a lot of like imitation, and eventually you find your voice itself. So yeah, it is fun to kind of, I can still look at a lot of that early stuff and cringe at it, but also like appreciate like how my blogging voice has evolved.
I still do that, where I go in and I archive stuff, and I'm not perfect, but I've done pretty good about archiving some of my older stuff. My oldest website, I think, was in like 94. I made a site dedicated to to American literature figures. And I was like, I'm going to build this HTML site dedicated to these figures, and I'm going to put like Faulkner up there and Richard Wright. And I did, but then I never wrote anything. It was just pictures with like, textured backgrounds, like they had those, and that's it. And it's one of my favorite sites because it's just a complete like failure. Like I just abandoned it, but it did teach me HTML. Yeah.
My Harry Potter's site, scandal noted. I'll put that up top. But like, this was, only like 2 books existed at the time that I wrote this. There was like, it was all stolen material, right? Like there was like a whole page that was like, here's every spell, that's been in the book so far. It was like a dictionary of spells. Like I'm sure I ripped that off some other kids' Harry Potter, or it was like, here's all the rumors that we've heard about future books and that kind of that's kind of what it was. And then I was in like a blog ring of other Harry Potter fan sites, that was also in guest book, and like all that, all that kind of stuff was definitely a part of that, that exploration in frames, framing in different web pages, all that kind of stuff. I'd hand drawn all of the buttons on MS Paint, for like the home button and like the buttons for all the sub pages and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So when you started, you're doing all this, but then you're also going to college, and you go to the University of Oklahoma, which kind of later on is where I meet you. But like, do you say, hey, I'm gonna like major in writing? Like what is that like? What does the scene look like when you're in college and you're thinking about your writing? And where is the web like that? Because Tom was saying in the comments, like, child of the web. Like, what does that look like? Put us in a context.
So so I came to school, and I like a lot of kids, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to major in, but and I'm thinking about this more from a career perspective. And actually, one of my early websites I had built with another guy in my town who was older than me, who it's questionable whether I should have been like chatting with him and building websites. But anyways, his perspective was like, separate your art from your profession. Like, if you love doing this stuff, don't major in it. It's like, all right, that's so I came in, I was like, well, I liked chemistry, so I'll be like a pharmacy major or something like that. And it wasn't within 2 weeks of being in school that like I'm there and I'm like, I am not going to be like a chemistry major or do this. And this brand new building had opened up on campus, which was what used to be the School of Journalism had sort of like graduated to this College of Journalism, and it was a brand new building that housed journalism, broadcasting, advertising, public relations, those kind of majors. And I remember the night before school started, we're running around campus and we're trying to find our classes, and I find this building and I'm inside of it, and I see like switchers and computer labs full of Macs, and I'm just like, I've got to get in. Like, I just want to like touch buttons, and pull levers and that kind of stuff. So I like immediately switched over to broadcasting. And I applied to work at the newspaper, but I specifically applied to work at oudaily.com, which was like the web version of the newspaper. And the fun fact is oudaily.com was one of the first student newspapers to have a website. It predates New York Times having a website. And it became a product of a really tragic situation, which was the Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995. And, the students thought of, we want a way to put out, updates of what's happened, what's happening. And so they built, a kind of subpage on the university system. And that eventually became, what became the oudaily.com, and so the big website for it. So I worked, that's what I first did, was I was an editor for oudaily.com, which is basically, we take the stories that were written for the newspaper and, we'd publish them to the website, but we also did like video content and stuff like that as well. So like, from the second that I get to OU, basically I'm doing something that is involved with not just like a web presence, major web presence, but like kind of like a seminal piece as far as like student journalism goes, and that's just, like a really interesting and special thing still to this day that I'm like really proud that I was a part of.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, as you said, like the OU, the web newspaper at OU resulting from a huge kind of, tragedy that happens in the 90s. And in fact, a lot of people link just 6 or 7 years later, right? The birth and the kind of rise of blogging and the network culture that we kind of will become known as, Web 2.0 as post, 9/11, when you have all of these kind of, if I was in New York during 9/11, and one of the things is you couldn't really get reliable information, you couldn't reach people. So the web became this alternative, right? And so people were now posting on the web and trying to find out information there. And that was still in the transition when we hadn't full born and trusted the web entirely, because the dot-com bust was kind of on the horizon too. But it's kind of interesting how these historic moments, tragic, right? At least in these two cases, resulted in a kind of new kind of opportunity, if you will, for revisiting the value of the web in the 90s and then again in 2000, right? I mean, it's or 2001.
Absolutely, and following the history of our student paper. So I mentioned, it's a daily newspaper, published 5 days a
Which is
week,
intense,
printed.
actually.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah. You better believe that like every writer is like got like like smoking in the back of the building, just like just sweating, at all times. Like it was a lot to put something out on a regular basis, But watching the evolution of kind of like a paper only to a paper first, but the digital piece, kind of still being a presence, to the paper now the paper itself doesn't exist. It went from 5 days a week to, I don't know, like 3 days a week to, to like, now it's like like a quarterly magazine, but like there's no paper being printed, and
Yeah.
for me in the classroom, you'd walk into a class and everyone had a paper in their hand and they're either reading it or doing the crossword or something like that. That doesn't exist. But like to kind of watch that evolution where, it's they're still publishing on a daily basis, right? But it's not like they're putting out a single artifact. It's just like it's constant publishing happening as well, and that whole move of like information exchange and it going from what information can we get by 4 o'clock so we can write the story, and publish at 11 or whatever, to just constant evolving like news information, I think is, you can point to that whole evolution as a big piece of how our culture has changed, right? Since we've seen like the birth of the web.
It's interesting too, because, and I like to say it's interesting, just so you know. I don't know if that's interesting, so you know that, but I always say it, and I listen to these sometimes.
And the best thing about podcasting is like you learn like all your ticks, like oh my
saying,
gosh,
is it really that interesting?
Yeah, my own for that is fascinating. Like I don't know why, but you say interesting, I'm like that's really fascinating.
You fascinate me. But there is a point I was trying to make, interesting or not, that you coming up as a journalist and studying journalism, how do you imagine the shift when you saw people writing, like you said, up all night for the daily, as it's shifting now to fully online and, the actual print version is an afterthought or a quarterly release? Like, what does that do to the actual fabric of the news, or the actual fabric in some ways of the writing? And obviously I'm projecting here a little bit. I'm not asking you to give me a dissertation here, but like, what does that do to writing? And then how does that change all of our writing, that you kind of a vision of the blog as we're writing very differently than if we were writing for a newspaper in the moment, right?
Yeah, so it's such a great question. So the piece that I've thought about a lot with that is,
It was a messy question, but thank you for
no,
saying
no, it's good. It's good. Yeah, it's a very fascinating question. So I always think of like a newspaper. You hear this term a lot of like it's like the first draft of history, right? And it may not be perfect, but it is something that's like a point in time look. To tie back to the Oklahoma City memorial bombing, one of the student journalists was one of the first people to kind of, at the time we didn't know why it happened, right? And there was a lot of theories. A lot of which tied to very similar theories that came out, about 9/11. But like an OU student journalist was the first to be like, oh, this date, April 19th, is actually like an anniversary that has to do with like these, what's happened in Waco. And I wonder if that has anything to do with why this happened, and put this out like as, and as a possibility for like what was the motivation behind this. And so in that case, the student, was one of the first to kind of have that thought. And so the thing I think about as I think about the evolution is just about every newspaper that the OE Daily's ever printed has existed in some hard copy. It's in some archive. It's now been digitized. And, if you want to look back and see anything fortunate or unfortunate that was written by a student, nothing went through like a faculty editor or editorial board or anything like that. Like, it was like whatever you put out, they would ream us the next day, but no one ever stopped anything from getting published. Like, it was a real independent student voice.
Yeah.
So I think about the fact that, like, if you want to look back for the last 100 years, you can get a sense of like what students were thinking about relative to the university, right? And I'm not convinced you can do that with, the web. The web is much more ephemeral. And, we haven't archived, when I think about this from a university perspective, right? We haven't archived our web presence or like what's been put out in like the bits and bytes of media at a university, right? Like, you can't just go to that archive and see, like, there obviously are like internet archive and tools that you can kind of hack your way to seeing things, but like it's not as it's not a direct path to understanding like the history of something. And so that's, it's not directly answering your question, but it is like the thing that I've thought about the most is like, what should we be doing from like a digital side of things as a university to make sure that, if someone is writing a dissertation, what was it like to be a university student, during the early part of the 21st century or whatever. It's going to be a much harder task than it probably, would be to write about, something that was in an era where we've got a lot of data sources that you can kind of pull from.
Do you think that there's less independence, say, with a student paper, right? Say, and I don't know why we're going to student papers, but I'm interested in this. But do you think there's less independence on a student newspaper, not particularly OU's, but anyone, given the fact of how global it is now? Whereas at a certain point, not but 40 years ago, it'd be very localized, right? That wouldn't necessarily be picked up by a major news outlet or gone viral in different ways than it can now. So does that change the oversight maybe the university might have?
It's a really good question, also fascinating. That, the way, so what made the OU Daily Voice very independent for a long time was that very little funding came from the central part of the university, because they could almost self-fund themselves through ads, that they could sell in the paper. And so part of my job as production, right, was that at the beginning of the day, it was like, all right, well, I'd basically have a spreadsheet list of like, here's all the ads that have been bought, right? And the designer would give me the ads, and I would basically build, okay, because of the number of ads we have, we can do a 12-page paper, a 16-page paper, a 32-page paper, right? Based off of what was in there. And then I would give it to the editors, right? Who then I'd be like, all right, we got to fill 32 pages, or we got to fill 12 pages. And so that was how the newspaper essentially operated. As advertising moved away from traditional media, really near the recession in 2008, right? And this is happening where the rise of digital advertising is happening at the same moment, and it's all shifting that direction. And social media is becoming a thing, and you can now target people in ways it's not just your geographical through newspapers, but you can also do based through psychographics and all the other stuff that kind of comes to be, right? The paper, there's still like a want and a need and a desire for that to still exist, but it doesn't have the funding mechanism that it used to have before, right? And so what happens is, the university says, we still want it, like we still like really value this, and we still want to like be able to offer this as an opportunity. We'll give more money to it, And so that's where you start thinking about, well, how independent can you be from the university you're trying to cover and critique and try to be a watchdog for, at the same time of which there's sort of like your funding mechanism, because do you want to write the article about, I'll just pick an example for no reason, but like the vice president of student affairs, which is like where your big funding source is, or something like that. That's where that stuff starts to get like a lot more murky for sure.
Yeah, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds, but I mean, in some ways, it's beautiful kind of microcosm of the broader macrocosm of what kind of the news cycle and the idea of like, where do you get your news? How do we rely on our news? Right. Some of the kind of struggles we find ourselves in as a society trying to deal with information and make sense of information. So as a journalist, right? So you studied as a journalist, you taught journalism, right? What are the kind of, in your mind, are there independent journalists, investigative journalists? Is this like a great moment for them, given the fact that there's the web? Or is it impossible given the fact that most of their work probably has to be self-funded? Like, is funding still the mechanism that is challenging a writer who might, like you, study journalism and then go out in the world and want to kind of break a big story? But at the end of the day, where are they going to go to do that?
Yeah. So I think that
Fascinating.
there, super fascinating. Great question. You're such a good student, Jim.
Thank you.
You know, you bring so much to our classroom discussion.
This really hurts. Thank you, though.
And you're a great writer. I should say. You know, you've worked hard for where you've got.
Thank you. More, please. Fascinating.
I think it's much more difficult to be. I don't know what a right example is, but let's say Bob Woodward, right, today than it would be, right? Who gets like full access to something, has like a funding mechanism that is a large entity, but it's much easier, right? Like so, like you know, like building audiences of millions is more difficult, but your ability to build audiences of thousands is almost infinite, right? And so, you know, journalism, like what you see is a lot of amateur, you know, work being put out there because there are more channels to put it out there, and it's not necessarily just writing. It might be podcasting, it might be YouTube, like whatever it is, right? There's just more opportunities to put it out there. And so in some ways, right, you hear this a lot, it's like it's democratized the ability to kind of generate information. And with that, it's democratized the ability to generate misinformation and everything else that's out there. And so, but yeah, it becomes much more complicated. It's interesting from a faculty perspective. We see a lot of students who come into the college, and I'll just to be clear, I was on faculty for 8 years at the Gaylord College of Journalism and Mass Communication. I specifically taught strategic communication classes, which was like advertising and public relations. What we'd see is a lot of freshmen come in as journalism majors. It's straight up journalism. And I feel like journalism is still a field that attracts students who want to bring voices, you know, to people who can't speak a lot of times. Like they, you know, kind of have a suspectful eye towards authority and those kind of things, and they want to impact change. So they come in with a lot of good reasons for like why they want to be in it. I see them kind of specialize more, you know, and so freshmen, they're coming in as journalism, and they're like, oh well, and this is what I did. I switched from broadcasting to advertising, you know, because it's like, well, that seems like that's more stable, and I can think of jobs that exist in advertising where I can design and I can write, but you know, I can also be funded, right, in ways of doing that. And so you see a lot of that as well, is or a student who does graduate with journalism ends up being a publicist, or you know, do things that feel like it's got like a little bit more backing. So yeah, it is the career of becoming, you know, the long-term writer. As possible, maybe not, you know, but it's not impossible. My college roommate was someone who all he ever wanted to do was be a sports journalist, you know, and he was basically like, I want to write for the, you know, Boston Globe, the New York Times, or the LA Times. Like that's all you know. And I was like, that's a pretty short list, you know. He's worked for the Boston Globe and the LA Times, and he now works for ESPN, you know. And it's just like it is possible. It's still you know, a career, but I do feel like there's less sort of direct paths to those kind of jobs.
No, absolutely. And it's what I'm thinking about here, when we talk about, writing and writing on the web. And for example, one of the people we talked with early on was Audrey Waters. And Audrey Waters is probably the closest I can think to
Mhm.
like an investigative journalist, even though she doesn't consider herself a journalist at all, but kind of the closest ed tech has, right? To
Mhm.
someone who's doing the work and being a watchdog and doing all those things that define that kind of student you had talked about. Um, but like, what are the options for folks like that often? Like Patreon, right? Like, hey, I need to write a book, go fund me, right? Or I need to like that's the interesting piece right now is like without those opportunities, and as much as I love writing on the web and not necessarily a writer, it does open up huge questions around like, who's gonna do the hard work and who's gonna
Yeah,
pay them to do it?
I think.
Not me.
Well, I
I'm
think
not doing it.
everything starts with building an audience, and that's the piece that I find that's also hard. I mean, uh, to think about where we were when we met,
Yeah.
over a decade ago was a different world as far as the ability to just like kind of meet people that were in a space and like find new information and kind of consume it, right? And so in ways through tools like Twitter, people were able to build audiences and amplify
Yeah.
stuff, to those niche audiences as well. And that's a piece that even as the web has evolved, right? Like, is another factor of like it's just like how it's even more difficult to think about how to build audiences. I was
Yeah.
talking with someone the other day about we I used to do a ton of assignments that was start a blog, start a Twitter account, tweet out what you're doing, and like I'm at the today I'm like, I don't know, like would I recommend that to people in the same way I would before? Or I'm like, yeah, let's all get Twitter accounts and be like, it's just like that's not the kind of assignment I would
Blue
feel
sky.
comfortable doing in the same way. I don't know. Do you feel the same way? It's like it just kind of feels weird of like of pushing someone into those spaces in the same way than what I
Absolutely.
used to.
I mean, I'm not teaching like I once was, right? With DS-106, that was kind of like, yeah, you go on Twitter because that's where the network is and that's where you
Yeah.
connect. And it did seem not nearly as contentious as it would be now, or just downright dangerous for people, but it's one of the things that, I was chatting with Alan and Tom quickly at the beginning here. It's one of the things that I'm kind of struggling with this kind of series is what when we talk about writing, right? And we all have our history of writing coming up at that time you're talking about. The other question to me is we're in a different moment where those platforms seem a bit more performative, whether it's Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook for their various reasons, right? And they deal with different kind of audiences in different ways, and there are different kinds of writing. But that kind of relational, like professional, personal space that the blogs often inhabited, they seem to have kind of disappeared or diffused a little bit. Not disappeared, that would be unfair to myself and two other people out there blogging. But the idea is like, where do you see like that kind of that regaining of audience or that return to an audience? Because I don't think like the web is dead and now AI is going to take over and that. I just think things are going to move, right? It just happens. It happens all the time. Well, people will go to different places. And I'm not pretending they'll all go back to the blog, but I think people will start to get tired of the platforms and start to get tired of the limits there. Um, and I just wonder, for the very reasons you talked about with Twitter, I wonder what your thoughts are. Like, do you think that it's all just going to be performative on LinkedIn or Facebook, or if there'll be a new subculture like you discovered early on that emerges?
So I guess I'll start with I think it's always been performative, right? Like for me
Yeah.
in fifth grade, performing for my class whatever it was, right? Like it's always been a little bit performative, however much we want to admit it or not. Like that
Yeah.
is part of the, for me, kind of the creating the art is like the performance piece of it. It's almost like my ability to become the version of myself I wish I was, or like, or put out the like part of it, like I'm not afraid to like admit, the part of it is like um, what motivates us is the audience piece of it. And if it doesn't, if it doesn't exist, right, it's much more difficult. Now, I still use my blog. I mostly when I blog now, I will kind of cross post it, on LinkedIn, and I still put it on my blog. Although it's, crickets over there, to me, it's still like that is my, that, like I imagine that my best archive of everything that I've ever done, right, is going to be that top level domain, adamcroom.com, where you can kind of see the collection. But like where it's going to go is probably going to change a lot, just depending on where eyeballs are. Like I want to share,
Yeah.
and I want to learn. And oftentimes when I chat with colleagues today, something I'm always asking, we used to hang out a lot at conferences, and I needed that a lot because I didn't have peers at my own institution that were dealing with a lot of the problems. I would learn so much just from being around people at conferences. So I ask everyone, like, where are you going? Like where are we, where can we meet up? Like, where are the conversations happening? Where are the rooms that I'm not in? And everyone kind of says the same thing. They're like, I'm not doing, like, I don't think I get anything out of that anymore. And that's like an interesting, like, what changed, right? That like we don't want to gather, whether that's physically or whether that's on a social media site, right? Or whatever it is. It just like people just like kind of feel like they're not. And I for me, I kind of do associate a lot of that with COVID, of just like people
Yeah.
feel very comfortable not gathering, for multiple reasons, many of which are probably really good, at times. But it's just like, it's also just kind of turn people off of like, how do we intellectually gather, right? And I miss that a lot because I think we go further faster, when we're sharing with each other, in common spaces.
So it's interesting because you both see, COVID may have had an impact, but you're saying you miss it.
Oh yeah, like I still want to do it, like almost more than ever, because the problems, as you mentioned, are more complex now, and like
Yeah.
it takes like the hive, right, that kind of mind hive, um, and I find myself, even reaching out, like I want to do this because like I want to find myself in conversations again. I've watched all the things that you've done in this series, and just like for me, it's taken me back, right, to like I was like, oh my gosh, these are my friends, like like I miss a lot of that sort of like intellectual kind of information exchange that we used to have, that whether that was through blogs, right, or through getting together in the various different ways that we've done it, over time.
So it's interesting. I'm going to show you something. This is the first time I've ever done this on this. Um, what would we call this? This is the first time I've ever done this on this series. So bear with me. But I want to see your reaction to a very interesting. So Michael Branson Smith, who is talking to me. Oh, actually, here it is. So him and Tom Woodward are going to help Reclaim develop a site for our site, our Reclaim Open. So can you see that?
No.
Okay, good. I'll show it to you now. So check this out. This is a link found on Waxy Links from Andy Bayo's site, I think. And I think because Michael Branson Smith showed me this today. And this is, according to some, the first like blog, right?
No
It's
kidding.
like the first,
awesome.
I mean, whether it is or not, the last post was in 2003. And this guy's Justin Links. He's talking about meeting with, a young Larry Lessig in Tokyo as he's preparing his, going to Stanford to teach law. It's interesting. But like the idea of, when I see this site and when I see like this moment, 2003, and that sense of connection, right? you can't predict what's going to happen or what someone's going to do and where that will go. And I wonder if that's a very similar thing right now. There's a certain amount of ennui, right, with the platforms. And you're right, everything's performative, even blogging. I'm probably making that, it's almost a distinction that's not fair because I'm kind of favoring blogging, saying it's true, it's real, it's not performative, but that's not true. But I also wonder, like, what is it? And I'm interested in this because we're going to do in Reclaim Open a kind of space where we're kind of encourage people to submit their proposal or whatever as a blog post, and they will perform it as a blog post, and there will be a live stream where people comment as a blog post. But the idea is a return to spaces of writing and interaction, like you're saying, around the conference, though it's online and it's literally, quote unquote, a blog, to kind of like reinvigorate what do those connections mean. And as I was saying again earlier with Tom and Alan, I'm not trying to be necessarily like it was good back then and now it's bad, but I'm wondering, like, what are some of the connections or synapses that might say, oh, there are alternatives, right? Because it just seems like there's a like obelisk in the, an obelisk in the desert. And then we're like, oh, we can do something different. I can use this bone to crack your skull and, take all your goodies or whatever. Maybe there will be another obelisk moment for the web.
It's certainly possible, right? Is that like everything that's old is new again. I think it, is just like I don't know. I think about it from like will the infrastructure always exist? Will it evolve? Like how do you evolve with it? And from a technological side of things, I think is really interesting. But I think you're doing the hard work that is necessary to do this stuff, which is like the curation side of it, right? Again, to sort of my early analogy of like if I throw a party with people that all learned from Lisa, to me, like everything's like I just want to throw parties, mostly just to like convince smart people to be in the same place together, right? Like it's almost like I'm just I'm going to call something a party, and it's a trick to get like interesting people thinking together in a space. And I think that requires someone who kind of can be that central node in the network or something. It doesn't have to be someone, it could be like a topic or whatever, but it does take someone to put together that space and curate it and foster it, and in some ways be the person who's also willing to poke and do it. Like you've got to you have to have a gardener for every garden, right? And so like what I appreciate about what you're doing is your willingness to like continue to kind of bring community together in us, in spaces.
Well, it's interesting too, or shall I say fascinating, that I love this, but there is a post-COVID kind of, like you said, reluctance or just what inertia. I don't know what it is. And we all suffer for it. I mean, I'm doing this because, I want people to come to the conference and like, I still blog. So I want other people to read my blog and comment, and I want there to still be a space there. But like, also to your point, I am missing it. Like, yeah. I have made real good friends. I have made real good connections. And while, writing was always a means kind of to foster those connections and create those links, right? And that idea of, promoting and celebrating one another if we can in a real way, right? That was it. But I think it's been a rough kind of run, especially for the educational technologists out there who actually had the Herculean task of kind of putting their universities on their back during COVID. But I could also imagine there's another factor, and I am not necessarily an AI hater, don't get me wrong, but there's also a specter like, is this stuff even relevant anymore? Because here's the future. And I think that's obviously a very simplified way of saying that on my part. I'm not suggesting like it's not, or that AI doesn't have a role in it, but I think there's just a certain amount of like general anxiety and, a general sense of where do we all fit in and what's our role now? And I think that's interesting. And I think part of my trying to do this is writing through it, right? Trying to
Yeah.
make sense of it.
I've been trying to think about how do these worlds kind of coexist, right? This kind of AI world and like the web that I love too. And I don't know how much you've read about or discussed like vibe coding and that kind of stuff, but like so one of the
It's a
things that
vibe.
I've always been vibe coding. Like I'm not a programmer,
I'm a
right?
total
Like
vibe coder.
yeah. Like I was like, oh, I finally got like a way of describing my entire career trajectory, which was stealing code from Lisa to start, and then eventually using CMSs like WordPress, that got in themes and just my deity Anders Noren, but so one of the things that I was reading like a Reddit post about a guy who had built this entire game through vibe coding. Basically, they're putting prompts into an AI chat, and creating this game. I was like, that's really fascinating. And I spent some time. That was fascinating. It wasn't
That was
interesting,
good.
but it
It
was
sounds good
yeah,
though.
yeah.
The way you do it is much more interesting than the way I do it.
And so I went to it and I was like, I wonder if I can just create my prompt was like, I want it to be a single page. Like it's gotta like exist as like an HTML document, and like all like the JavaScript and CSS has to be baked into it. But I want to build like a unique style of a Scrabble game, basically, And so I've never written a blog post about this. I should probably blog about it, but anyone can, if you want to check out adamcroom.com/Scrabble game.html. Like it's it's sort of like a weird Scrabble game that's been completely vibe coded, through me talking to AI saying we'll fix this and fix this, and this isn't necessarily working the way that I want to do it. Basically like pull it up.
I'm gonna pull it up.
Man.
Absolutely.
We're gonna do a live demo. So it's adamcroom.com. Yeah, this is it. Scrabble twist is what we came up with. So it's basically like how many Scrabble words can you do in 120 seconds? So you've got to hit start game.
Okay. And I gotta find words.
Yeah, well, there should be a bank if you. I can't see everything on there, but if you scroll down, there should be some letter tiles.
Got it. Okay.
Now here's the problem is that the entire it's not the entire dictionary of words, because it's all in one page. So it's got like 500 words that you can probably like play with, but not everything's in there. So anyways, but this was like a really.
What is the DW? What does the DW mean?
That's like double word and triple letter. So like you get more points if you're using some of these.
Gotcha. So I can just grab this on here. I can go like P.
Yeah, you can put it anywhere.
Oh, I could go O.
Yep.
And then I can go T.
Yeah. See if you can submit that. There should be like some kind of submit button maybe or something like that.
Yeah. Where is it? Oh yeah.
Play word.
Play word. Okay. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You did that all vibe coding?
It's just me talking to AI, and it's created this. So it's like, those are the things that I find that are like kind of the intersection where I think is like, this is like the new evolution of what I've always done, which is like, use some kind of tool to build something that's like kind of interesting to me. The thing that I found, like I basically said, I just want to build like a kind of unique style of Scrabble. So its suggestions was, let's put it on, let's, make it time-based, and it's just one player and you can kind of put stuff wherever you want, kind of that. And it never works in the first try, but like, I was able to say like, well, this isn't working and I can't do this. And like, one of the early challenges was it wouldn't recall tiles, that button wasn't working. So like, fix that. And it's like, all right, we'll fix it, so anyways, like that's the kind of stuff that I find is like, well, this is interesting. Like, how do we tie these together in ways that, what WordPress was for me before, which was help me get 80% of the way, right? And stand up all the infrastructure so I can get quick to writing. Can AI do similar things for me, that kind of get me to the, to the end goal of the very simple thing that I want to build, whether that is classroom based and it's like, I want to do like some kind of simulation game, Twine was really big at one point, right? And you kind of build all these branch scenario stuff. Like, it's like, should I, AI that to some extent? What would that look like? Like, I don't know. That's how I'm thinking about my old world and my my new world, and trying to kind of like wrap my mind around it. It's just through noodling it, on this
So
kind of stuff.
so that's super cool, in fact, that you're kind of playing with that. And I love these examples because, like, I'm of the mindset, like, I'm here in like Reclaim World, and I'm kind of trying to make sense of just my daily life, right? And so I haven't really played with AI, but I love talking with folks who have. You heard the one with Tom and Amy,
Yeah.
and that's
Yep.
great. And Mike Caulfield is doing fun stuff.
Yep.
Like, I dig that. So here's my idea. This is my pitch, right? I got on my, Retro Pi, I got Madden 2001. It's a
Yes.
25-year-old football game, right? And so I can play a week, and I can simulate most of it, but I'll play a week as a team, and I'll capture all the stats and the highlights, and then I'll feed them into some sort of AI mechanisms that are out there that I know people say already exist, and have it write newspaper articles, do
Yes.
podcasts, create
Yes.
a whole world around this make-believe 25-year-old football season.
Yes.
I love that idea.
I think it's so fun. So, so to use a similar example,
Has it been done, Adam? Am I too
no,
late?
no. This is not. But it was. So my dad's a
Can
baseball
you
coach.
do it for me?
I'd love to. Absolutely.
Anyway,
what if
I'll
I'm
let
the
you talk.
reporter? No, I'll be the reporter that covers every week of you. And
Yeah, but
and
we have to let AI do it, so we don't have to do anything, which I kind of
Oh,
like
that's
too.
yeah, but I can determine. I mean, I can guide the AI of like, like, you be a real, like, come after the owner, or something like that.
Yeah, it'd be
So
interesting. Anyway,
my dad's a baseball coach, and he's, for forever, right? He's scored everything on a pad, right? And a lot of people love to go baseball games and keep score,
sure.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but now there are all these apps that are out there that allow you to keep score on your phone. And what's kind of neat about that is, if you're keeping score in real time on an app, well, then other people, a lot of parents now will like, use these, like, join and follow the game of their kids that are on my dad's baseball team. He coaches for a middle school in Oklahoma City Public Schools. If the parents can't be there, they can follow, kind of, it's, the score itself live. And if you want to take a second phone or camera and live stream it and have like all the banners that show, who's on what base and what the score is, like, it will do like all that kind of live stuff, which is neat. But
Yeah.
the thing that I found, like, was really wild when I first started to see AI be in there was, once you conclude a game, it drafts like an article that's like, Jimmy, hit a double, and pitched 2 innings, and the team won or whatever. Like, and it's like, wow, that's kind of crazy. But like, it's kind of, no, who was writing the story about this middle school baseball team anyways, right? Like, something exists, like, that is kind of an interesting, like, artifact to have that wouldn't have been there anyways. So it's like, and so, yeah, so I've wrestled with the ethics of, as like it is pretty easy to build sports stories based off of stat lines, right? And try to
Absolutely.
figure out what the storyline of the game could have been. And then I also mentioned, my college roommate's literally a sports reporter, like, so writing that sort of like game summary thing, probably was a bunch of work, but maybe not the most interesting thing to do. In fact, he covered the Lakers for a season, and he's like, "It's the biggest grind of my life." It's like, just write the story every night of what happened. It's not the most interesting thing. And so he wants to just feature stuff now, and like, was like,
Yeah.
way better and more interesting than like you're just generic at the end of the game stuff. So I don't want to devalue that kind of work, but it's like, that is like, that kind of stuff I do find, is kind of an interesting piece to be able to add.
Well, it's interesting because there it is.
Fantastic.
I actually did write for my school newspaper on the sports section with my friend, and he was the better writer of us. So he would write everything, and I would always be like, "Yeah, say this, say that," like, and he would never just. But it was just like, no, this person that many yards, this person an interception, this person, this many touchdowns, tackles if there was a big one, done. Like he had a formula that was easy and he was smart, right? But like, and I was always like, oh, I guess that's what I couldn't figure out. I couldn't figure out how to make something which seems so complex and big in my mind fairly systematic and simple.
Yeah.
And AI's good at that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It is. It's above average for sure. It's sort of doing that. So
Exactly. Well, look, Adam, you rule. I drool.
I'm so sorry I was late. I hope
I'm not-
this is still a
I
viable
thought this was
thing.
fascinating.
Okay, good.
No, man, are you kidding me? It was great talking to you. I appreciate you coming on the series and talking about writing, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say.
Can I turn this around? I know. Is there like a hard time limit on this?
No.
Can I ask you questions about like how has your writing evolved since you've been doing this? Like
I think
how do you?
It's unique, actually. I don't really think it has.
Yeah.
Like I still kind of write the same things I always did. I was joking with this when I was talking with Ken. Like I'm sure it's evolved in that, like, I go back and read some of my posts from, now 15 years ago, which is crazy. And I love some of them, but then I don't remember writing them. But I think there's been a constant thread of me liking to pull in pop culture and do stuff like that. But it's not like I've like been doing this thing and now it's like I see the book project, or now I see the next level of my writing, right? It's almost, for me, just like a kind of a way of, I don't know, like putting something out there and then saying, oh, that was cool, or that helped me do this, or that made me think to go through that. But the blog has always been like a sounding board, which I'm writing for other people. To your point, it's performative, but I'm also trying to work through, some of my own ideas. For example, I'm doing a podcast, as you know, we talked about this with Michael Branson Smith, that like 3 people listen to, and it's about film, and it's super fun, right? It's great fun. But then after those discussions, I come back to my blog and I'm like, there's this whole thing I wanted to talk about that I couldn't. And so I'm having a hard time keeping up with the podcast because they're so quick and you just talk and it's done. Whereas my blog post, I'm kind of trying to dig in on some of the things maybe I didn't talk about, or some of the concepts in these films that I think is interesting. And so I don't know, like the blog for me has just allowed me sometimes to just let my fancy free and just write about things that I kind of think interesting and connect me with my undergrad years and my grad school years and my love of kind of cultural bits. But it's been pretty consistent in that regard. I don't feel like it's like, and now I understand that I'm at the next level of my writing. I think my writing has been, pretty consistently like, subpar, if you will, in that regard, but like entertaining for me, Does that make sense?
That's great. Yeah. So can I tell one last story? I know, like, I'm
Absolutely.
sorry. I know there's like
I
a
love
dark
it.
time.
No.
Okay. Sorry. So when I started teaching for the first time, which was my first adjunct semester was like August 2013. And I was teaching a design-based class called PR Publications. And I'm writing my syllabus for the very first time. And I thought about, like, I was like, well, like, what's gonna be the final kind of project thing? And I was like, well, we'll just build a website, and I had like started like tinkering with WordPress in the last couple of years, and like this will be way easier than it could have been before. We can make this something that they spent the last few weeks on. That fall, this is the fall semester that I'm teaching, and it's October, and I go to this conference in Dallas, Texas, which was the MOOC Research Conference.
I know it.
And there was a keynote speaker there named Jim Groom, and you talked about DS 106. And for me, it was a big light bulb moment in that, like, it's like, oh, like the website doesn't have to be the final thing, like the thing that you put all the things that you put like in the website, like it can be the thing that narrates the entire learning journey, right? They get not as the last piece, but like the first piece. And so that's the only semester I ever taught where it was like the last thing. And every semester past that was day one, get the blog and write about your learning process, you know? So that was a big insight that I learned about writing that, you know, from you was like, let's flip this model. The second thing was, I had just joined, I'd just been asked to join this, like, again, MOOCs were big at the time. And Seth Godin had put out something called like Krypton or something like that. And it was like this, like, print out these PDFs and get together and, you know, read my books and talk about it, you know.
And pay me $10,000 to sit next
Exactly.
to me.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what writing is for Seth Godin. Yeah.
But someone was like, you know, does anyone want to, like, it was like 4 weeks of like, anyone want to meet up at a coffee shop, you know, once a month or something like that and kind of go through this? I was like, absolutely. But it was like, you know, part of the outcome was like build a project for yourself. And this same period, kind of like fall 2013, I was like, well, this is really interesting. Like, I started teaching this class, and you know, I'm having them build websites and blogging, and I've always been a writer, but I've kind of stopped publicly writing myself, and I want to get back into it. My project for that thing was like, I'm going to build my own domain, you know, and so that happened in November, December of 2013. I think my first post that I have on adamcroom.com is like December 31st, 2013.
It is
like right at the end of the year.
That actually,
yeah, and
that's so cool.
And so, like, you know, so anyways, I want to say, like, for me, you like, and as I mentioned, mimicking Chip Klosterman or Chuck Palahniuk, like, there's definitely, I can read some of my posts and I hear a lot of Jim Groom in there. So to get back to your point of like being like a consistent voice, you know, like it's very distinct in how you write. It's really approachable. It's very much yourself, you know. And I can read a lot of that stuff from 2013, 2014, you know, kind of, again, trying to find my plug voice and hearing a lot in there of you too. It's certainly evolved, but like, as a writer, you always carry pieces with you of like, you know, of you know, as you kind of grow, like we all just become, right? Like, so it's kind of end product of all our influences in some way, whether we know it or not, you know. And so you're definitely a piece of that. So I wanted to make sure it was on record that, you know, as I'm doing this myself, and then of course that led to a lot of things that we went on to do at OU, which was all the domain stuff, and you know, that's a different conversation.
Well, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, it's like Adam Croom kind of made Reclaim hosting a thing, because if OU maybe hadn't picked up on us early and believed in us, you know, it could have been a different conversation for what I'm doing with Reclaim hosting. So that's a big, you know, that love runs both ways. And I think, to me, man, that's the point. Is like, yes, those relations through these words that don't necessarily have to end up in a book or a monograph or a treatise, but can be, you know, us stupid people working through our daily world, trying to make sense of what it is we do along other people, right? And, you know, obviously I joke, but like, there's that sense of like, you know, trying to share with someone who you would think that, you know, this is something we do and can do together and make sense of this space together, and hopefully have weird analogies and metaphors and cultural touch points that are keen to you or to me, but we can meet through them. Like, I think that's where I want to meet. And maybe that's actually even more important to me than my writing evolving, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think for, you know, because time gives you perspective, right? And you can look back and you can kind of see that where you learn the most is the moments in life where you were willing to just sort of like think out loud and like move, you know, just like put something out there, right? And like just see what it is, and then it evolves or it doesn't. It doesn't have to evolve. We can come out as a fully formed Jim Groom if we want.
Yeah. And that's not to mean that I shouldn't evolve. Let's be clear. But like and that's also probably my lack of perspective on my own work. right? Which is fair, right? Like, but yeah, I really like, I mean, it's super flattering that you should even say this, but like, I really like that, folks are able to communicate like this. It's a unique thing, right? Like through
Yeah.
words and those connections and those stories. And like, I know Adam Croom as a series of discussions and text and reflections as much as I do as a person that
Yeah.
I know and have hung out with. And like, there's like going back and reading your post before to get on this discussion was so interesting because I'm reading about a 5th grade Adam Croom, like using writing as an early tool to fit in, to make sense of, the political spectrum that is school and the social relations. And I think that's for me, that's a perfect analogy of kind of what writing is on the web sometimes for us right now to make sense, especially post COVID, as you said.
Yeah. And I don't, to be clear, I don't put it out there because I want to like, inflate your ego in any ways.
It doesn't need to
But
be.
it's like part of, I think, what keeps us going, right, is like acknowledging each other in the community, right, and like the
Yes.
value and the appreciation. That's the piece. Like that's
Agreed.
like again, like it's very difficult for someone to be motivated just to do this for nothing, but like for us to be able to continue to be able to talk through and not just like wax poetically about the olden days as you mentioned, right, and that was once better, but just like for us to like also be able to say like this is where you have like your writing, that work impacted me, and this is
Yeah.
like that's our fuel, right, like that's what keeps us doing like what we're doing. And so I think it's where my yearning for community is like the ability for us to continue to be able to do that kind of stuff. I think it's incredibly important.
That's brilliant. In fact, I think that's why I'm trying to do this. I think Marin's idea too. I think you nailed it. Like that's exactly right. And I hope we can do more of it because I just love the community we've built over the years and I want new people in. I just don't want it to stay static.
Yes.
But I'd like the idea of us not feeling like, we're alone, in this.
Well, thank you for bringing together a bunch of people who I have so much admiration for, and let me be a part of the conversation still, and continue to add to it. And I will add however I can contribute. I want to continue to do so.
Wow. Look, I just think the whole thing has been fascinating.
It's great. Super interesting conversation.
You're the best, man. Thank you for joining us.
All right,
Hold
buddy.
on. Let's get the outage here. We can do this. We've done it. We have the technology. Are you ready?
Let's hear it.
Okay, let's see.